Welcome to the Shema podcast series, The Power of the Hebrew Months. Each month of the Jewish year carries its own unique energy, a spiritual rhythm woven into creation itself. Our sages teach that the months are not just markers of time, but windows of opportunity, each with its own avoda and pathway for growth. In this monthly series, I will guide you into the flow of sacred time. Together, we'll uncover the spiritual work, the inner energy, and the actions you can take to stay in sync with the month. Think of it as your spiritual workout routine, written into the Torah's calendar. Month by month, we'll train the soul, awaken new strengths, and live more fully in harmony with Hashem's design for time. Join us as we journey through the Hebrew months and discover how to channel the energy of time into lasting personal transformation. Welcome back to the Shema podcast, my friends. Another installment in our series, The Power of the Hebrew Months. At the end of the episode we did on Av, I mentioned that I was considering making the tribes the primary lens for season 2 as a way of diving in and understanding the avoda for each month. But as I began preparing and doing the research for the month of Elul, I realized that narrowing our research of the month through that one vantage point would cause us to lose too much insight. And really, to truly understand the avoda of a Hebrew month, we need to open up and have access to all aspects, the letter, the sense, the mazal, the tribe, the bodily, faculty, everything. And this season, I want to add something additional we did not do last season, and that is looking at the permutation of Hashem's 4-letter name, the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. We will get more into that. And Elul showed me something I had not expected. In most months, these different aspects that I mentioned, the letter, the sense, the mazal, the tribe, etc., seem to give us a different vantage point towards the same thing, the same theme. But this is what blew me away. In Elul, they do something way more. They actually provide the sequence of how to do teshuvah. So rather than merely describing teshuvah from different vantage points and different angles, they actually walk us through the process step by step. And this was so mind-opening. It gave me like such a different understanding of what teshuvah is really all about. So that's how I'm going to approach this episode. Rather than treating the different aspects of Elul as separate insights, we're going to follow them in order and see how the structure of the month itself gives us a framework, a practical map for teshuvah. Also, throughout this series, we have returned again, the idea that Jewish time is not linear or a circle, but a spiral ascending upward. And we have also returned to the deeper purpose of our lives, the teaching from the Baal Salam, that the goal of our life is to move from the will to receive to the will to bestow. And that's happened over and has been happening over history and is what we are each personally responsible for. I would say probably more so in our generation as we get closer and closer to Mashiach. What becomes especially significant in the month of Elul is the way Hashem built that very movement of moving from will to receive to will to bestow into the structure of the year itself, into time. So time is not merely marking our progress, it's actually there to facilitate this very movement, this very mission of mankind led by the Jewish people. So if you think about it, this will make more sense if you back out and look at it from a 20,000-foot view perspective of the year. Nisan, the first month of our spiritual year, begins almost entirely with receiving. Hashem takes us out of Mitzrayim, reveals himself, gives us identity, and carries us into redemption, total receiving. The initiative comes from above. We had not earned anything, as we've discussed before. But as the months progress, what we have received begins demanding something from us. ER asks us to refine what we received. Sivan gives us Torah and asks us to act on it. Tammuz tests whether it remains real when clarity fractures. And Av asks whether we can remain in a relationship with Hashem when the meaning of what is happening is still hidden. Then we arrive at Elul. There's one calendar point worth clarifying because Elul occupies actually sort of two positions at once. And here's what I mean by that. There are two start and end cycles to the Hebrew calendar. There is the Nisan to Adar cycle that tracks the birth and cycle growth of the Jewish people, and the Tishrei to Elul cycle that tracks the birth of the physical world and the rest of humanity. So in the Nisan to Adar cycle, Elul is the 6th month. That cycle traces the spiritual movement of the months, beginning with redemption and receiving in Nisan, and gradually moving towards bestowal. But Rosh Hashanah begins the annual cycle in Tishrei. So in that Tishrei to Elul framework, Elul is the final month of the year, the time to gather, evaluate, and complete what this year of life has produced before entering the next year. So the two calendars are measuring different things, and Elul stands at the intersection of both. It is a point where receiving begins to pivot into response and bestowal, and it is the point where we gather the year we have been given before beginning again. Hashem gives us life, Torah, opportunities, relationships, abilities, challenges, and another year in which to use them. And so Elul asks, what has become of what I have received so far? Nisan begins with Hashem giving. Elul asks what we are going to do with what he has given us. Or to say all that a little differently, in the cycle of spiritual growth that begins in Nisan, we are basically flipping at month 6, because we're month 6 in that cycle from receiving from Hashem to now shifting into bestowing back to Hashem. In the cycle of the year for the rest of the world, Elul is the final month. And so it is a point in time, again, where we're going to gather everything we learned and build from that. So this intersection is very pivotal to our avoda in the month of Elul. The first step in Elul's teshuvah process is actually prepared for us by the month that immediately precedes it. Before we can decide what needs to change, we first have to gather the year honestly and understand what it has revealed. So last month in Av, we learned that the sense associated with the month is hearing. Unlike sight, which can take in a scene almost instantaneously, hearing unfolds over time. A sentence has a beginning, middle, and end. And if we stop listening halfway through, we can completely misunderstand what is being said. That became one of the central lessons of Av. We have a tendency to judge situations or our life in the middle of the sentence. Something painful can happen, our door can close. Something we thought Hashem was helping us build seems to fall apart, and we immediately decide what it means. Av taught us to keep listening instead of interrupting Hashem before he has finished his sentence. What appears to be contradiction or loss may still be part of a process whose meaning has not fully emerged. We compare this to a sea beneath the ground. What looks like disintegration may actually be the breaking down of an old form so the hidden life can now emerge in a new one. And that becomes the first step of Elul. before we judge the year, we listen back over it. One of the ideas Rob Dolbear-Pinson develops in his book on Elul is that ending can actually be harder than beginning. Beginnings come with novelty and excitement. Ending requires us to remain with something after the excitement has faded and gather what remains. Before racing towards Rosh Hashanah and imagining who we hope to become next year, Elul is asking us to just finish this year. And that does not simply mean allowing the calendar to reach its final day, waiting for just time to pass. It means gathering the year inwardly, taking stock of the experiences that shaped us and allowing them to reveal something about the person that we have become. Before teshuvah can redirect anything, we first have to see clearly what this year has actually formed within us. We have to listen to the year before we try to change its direction. And this is where teshuvah begins to look different. Teshuvah certainly includes identifying what we did wrong and taking responsibility for it, having remorse and repairing what can be repaired. But if teshuvah only is an inventory of everything bad that we did, we can easily begin to define ourselves by the failures, which is, of course, not the goal and totally counterproductive. The Elul material that I learned suggests something much deeper. Every action, everything we do is fueled by an energy. And the underlying energy itself, of course, is not bad. The problem is that that energy became misdirected. So a drive, desire, or need can take on a distorted form when it is directed toward the wrong end. Teshuvah, therefore, is not about eliminating the underlying energy. It is about separating it from the form it took and returning it to its proper purpose. And that means the very area that caused the greatest difficulty in this year contains the very energy that will produce the greatest growth next year. Elul and the avoda of teshuvah ask us not to suppress what went wrong, but to reclaim it. Once we have gathered what the year revealed, step 2 in the process of teshuvah is to move beneath the surface of what happened and trace our behavior back towards its inner source. Elul gives us the direction of that movement through the monthly permutation of Hashem's 4-letter name. Before looking at Elul's particular permutation, we need to understand why these permutations matter at all. Rav Dolbear-Pinson explains that the 4-letter name, the Yud K Vav K, expresses Hashem as the source continually bringing all of reality into being. The name is therefore connected not only with existence itself, but with time. Each period of time carries its own particular expression of that divine life force. The Hebrew months reflect this through different arrangements of the same 4 letters. Rav Pinson describes each month as having an inner light that shines through the prism of its particular permutation. The letters do not change, but the order does. And that different order expresses a different spiritual movement within the month. Because the name contains 4 letters, with the Hey appearing twice, there are 12 distinct arrangements corresponding to the 12 months. For Elul, the permutation is Hey, then Vav, then Yud. And this particular order is remarkably well suited to teshuvah, as we will see. Rav Pinson explains that the letters can be understood in terms of receiving and giving, or back to will to receive and will to bestow. The 2 Heys represent receiving, while the Vav and the Yud represent giving. Elul sequence begins at the lowest level of receiving and moves progressively upward toward the Yud, the highest point of giving and concentrated divine potential. He therefore describes the permutation as a movement from below upward, beginning with the lower hay associated with our actions, moving through the deeper levels within us, and ultimately toward the Yud, which is the source. That means the very permutation of Elul describes teshuvah as a movement of return. We take the life we have received, gather what we actually did with it, and trace our outward behavior back inward toward the forces that produced it. The purpose is not merely to correct the external, visible behavior, but to bring the life and energy we were given back into conscious alignment with its source. Teshuvah still begins with the act itself. If behavior violated halakha, the behavior has to change. And whatever requires repair must be repaired. But Elul asks us not to stop with correcting the outward expression. The deeper work is to identify the desire, fear, need, habit, or assumption that was sustaining it. If that underlying energy remains untouched, the same struggle can simply emerge again, just in another form. The permutation, therefore, gives us the direction of the work from the outward life we live toward inward, towards its source. And eventually, that journey brings us back to the Yud. If the permutation tells us to trace the behavior inward, the third step tells us what we are looking for when we get there. That is where Elul's letter becomes important. The letter associated with Elul is Yud. The Yud is the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet, almost nothing more than a point. Yet every written letter begins from that initial point of contact. Rob Pinson describes it as a concentrated potential, the primal point from which form can emerge. Within a person, that gives us a powerful image. Beneath all the complexity of what happened this year, beneath the behavior, and even beneath the distortion, there is still a point of truth and potential waiting to be recovered. Rob Pinson points to something fascinating in the names Yaakov and Esau. Yaakov's name is spelled Yud, Ayin, Kuf, and Base. And if you pull the Yud away, you are just left with a Ayin, Kuf, and Base, which spells Akev, heel. And if that sounds familiar, the reason so is because it echoes the Torah's description of Yaakov's birth, when his yad, his hand, was grasping Esau's heel, his Akev. And Yud, spelt out, is Yad. The Yud plus the Akev is Yaakov's name. Esau's name is Ayin, Shin, Vav. And when you add a Yud to Esau's name, you get the word Asui, which means completed. And if you recall, in the Torah, it describes Esau as emerging already physically developed, almost like a finished product, completed, Asui. So again, just to sort of recap that, if you pull the Yud away from Yaakov's name, you get the word Akev, heel. If you add a Yud to Esau's name, you get Asui, completed. When they were born, Yaakov was grabbing Esau's heel, and Esau is described as being born fully complete. And this is the contrast. Esau represents the danger of seeing the self as already formed, as though who I am now is simply who I am. Yaakov represents becoming, struggle, transformation, and growth. Rob Pinson then brings another remarkable idea from a text called the Megillah Amukas. I may be pronouncing that wrong, but it's a major Kabbalistic work by Rabbi Natan Shapiro from the 17th century. And the idea is that Yaakov retrieves the Yud from the domain of Esau. Within the framework of Elul, that becomes a powerful image and idea about teshuvah. Even when one of our energies has taken a distorted form, the underlying power is not necessarily lost. The yud can still be recovered. Teshuvah does not sanctify the distortion. Arrogance remains arrogance. Cruelty remains cruelty. Self-indulgence remains self-indulgence. But teshuvah asks us to separate the distorted form from the deeper power that became trapped within it. The work is to identify the legitimate desire that was redirected into the wrong expression, and then recover that underlying potential without making excuses for the distortion itself. The recovered point of truth and potential is the yud. But teshuvah cannot stop with discovering what was buried underneath the distortion. The next, fourth step is to determine what that recovered potential can now become. And that brings us to the mazal associated with Elul, Betula, the Virgin Maiden, known in Latin as Virgo. The literal meaning of Betula is not potential, but as a symbolic image, it gives us a powerful way of understanding what comes next. A Betula represents the capacity for something new to be conceived and brought into the world, something that does not exist in completed form. And that parallels the yud beautifully. The yud represents concentrated potential before it takes form. Betula reminds us that although the past has already taken form, the future has not. Rob Pinson gives us a very practical way of working with that reality. We naturally tend to ask why. Why something happened, why we failed, or why Hashem allowed a particular circumstance to occur, which is highly unproductive. I mean, sometimes those questions may be necessary, but I've already taught us that we may still be in the middle of the sentence and simply not possess enough of the story to know the full reason. So Rob Pinson suggests shifting the question from why to toward what. So instead of remaining focused only on the cause of what happened, we begin asking where the experience can now lead, or what the recovered strength can now serve, and what new direction can emerge from what we have learned. The idea is that we cannot undo what has already taken form in the past. The failures are now part of the year we already live, but teshuvah teaches us that those experiences produced within us is still open and can be transformed. However, we do not return in order to become the person we were before the failure. We return to the point of truth and potential beneath it so that something new can emerge from what happened. And that is the role of Betula, the maiden, in this whole process. The past is fixed, but the future form of that recovered potential is not. And that is why step 4 is to envision the new form that this energy can now take. Betula allows us to envision a new form, but potential still needs direction. The next step, 5, is to gather the recovered energy and place it under a clear purpose. And that brings us to the tribe associated with Elul, which is God. God is a warrior tribe. Moshe's blessing describes God with lion-like strength, and the tribe becomes identified with warriors willing to go out in front of the nation in battle. A warrior cannot afford to have all his strength moving in competing directions. Power has to be gathered, disciplined, and directed toward a purpose. That is the contribution of God to the teshuvah process. Teshuvah is not about becoming weaker. It is about taking strength that became scattered or distorted and placing it back under a mission. And this is also where Rob Pinson's shift from asking why to asking toward what becomes useful, because we can spend enormous amounts of energy and time asking why something happened, why we failed, why Hashem allowed a particular circumstance, but Av has already taught us that we may not possess enough of the sentence to know every hidden reason. Once the Yud has been recovered, the next part of teshuvah is to give that power direction. The work is to take the strength, desire, or capacity we have uncovered and place it under a purposeful mission, one that serves growth, responsibility, relationship with Hashem, and avodas Hashem rather than pulling us away from them. That is the contribution of God to the process. Gather the power, give it mission, and redirect the Yud. Once the Yud has been redirected towards its proper purpose, the process has to move from intention into behavior. That brings us to perhaps the most practical aspect of the month. The faculty associated with Elul is asiyah, action. And this connects directly to what we have learned throughout the From Bina to Das series. Understanding is not yet transformation. We can recognize a truth, agree with it, and even feel deeply moved by it, but until the truth begins to shape the way we actually respond and behave, it has not yet fully entered Das. And that is why action is so important. We have traveled inward toward the Yud. We have recovered the deeper power. We have envisioned what it could become. We have redirected it toward a purpose. But if all that remains only insight, the process is incomplete. Asiyah, or action, requires us to give that truth a concentrated form and behavior. A sincere resolution is not yet enough. Intention alone does not create a new pattern. The work of Elul is to translate insight into a specific response that can actually be practiced when the relevant moment arises. That movement from insight to action is what begins carrying truth from Bina into Das. We are no longer only understanding what is true, we are beginning to live according to it. Asiyah gives the new direction a concrete action, but the old pattern does not disappear simply because we now know what we should do. The new response needs protection. And Elul tells us something about how that new action becomes possible. The bodily faculty associated with the month is the left hand or left arm. The left side is associated with Gevurah, restraint, boundary, and discipline. Gevurah creates a space in which the old automatic response can be interrupted, and a new response can be chosen. The old impulse may still arise, and the old habit may still feel natural. So the new action needs a boundary that protects it long enough for something new to begin forming. There's a beautiful physical image of this in tefillin. We place tefillin on the head, the place of consciousness and knowledge. We bind tefillin to the left arm and position them toward the heart. What is known in the head must penetrate the heart. What reaches the heart must become bound to the arm. And what is bound to the arm ultimately reaches the hand, the place of action. Truth has to become bound to the way we live. We now have the new action and the boundary that protects it. But for that response to become part of who we are, it has to be repeated long enough to take root. And finally, Elul opens a 40-day period extending through Yom Kippur. 40 repeatedly appears in Torah in connection with the idea of formation. The flood lasted 40 days. Moshe spent 40 days on Har Sinai, and Klei Yisrael spent 40 years being formed in the Midbar. So these 40 days are not primarily 40 days which we are supposed to accumulate enough regret before Yom Kippur. Rob Pinson brings the idea that repeated small positive actions begin creating a new pattern. We do not wait until the inner world has been completely transformed before behaving differently. Repeated action is one of the ways transformation occurs. These are 40 days of formation. The purpose is not simply to accumulate regret, but to use repeated action over time to shape a new pattern. Elul therefore asks us to move beyond recognizing what went wrong and forming the response we want to carry forward. And now we can see what is so amazing about Elul. Its different aspects have not simply given us different insights into teshuvah. They have walked us through teshuvah itself, hearing ask us to gather the year without prematurely judging the story. The permutation of Hashem's name takes us from outward behavior inward towards its source. The Yud asks us to recover the legitimate power hidden beneath the distortion. Betula, the maiden, asks us to envision the new form that power can take. The tribe, God, gathers and redirects that energy towards its proper mission. Asiya turns the insight into concrete action. The left side, the left arm, gives us the Gevura to protect that action from the old pattern. And the 40 days give us the time and repetition through which this new response begins forming part of who we are. That is teshuvah as return and transformation. The avoda of Elul, again, is not to make an overwhelming list of everything wrong with us or try to become an entirely different person in 30 days. It is to take one real area of struggle and work with it honestly and purposefully. That is why I created a teshuvah worksheet to accompany this episode. It follows the exact same sequence we just walked through, and it's designed to help you take one place where your energy became misdirected and turn the ideas we have discussed into practical avoda for Elul. My hope is that you come away not simply more aware of what went wrong, but more aware of what strength Hashem placed before you, what that strength is capable of becoming, and what concrete response you can begin practicing now. If you would like a copy of that teshuvah worksheet, you can reach out to me in the Shema Podcast WhatsApp group, which you can join through the link in the show notes, or you can email me at shemapodcastshow@gmail.com. My friends, Hashem gave us the year. The avoda of Elul is to take what Hashem gave us, recover the potential hidden within it, redirect it towards its true purpose, and begin to give it back.
Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed the episode and found it meaningful, please take a moment to rate, review, and share the podcast.